So, hi everyone, and welcome to talk about Immersive and about on VR. And of course, VR by its nature, it's already really immersive media, but there are a lot of little things that you can really easily break the immersion for the player. And let's take a look at some of those things. I'm mostly going to talk about this around this game called Downward Spiral. It's a game that we are developing right now. And we got a prologue out of it in the start of this year. And it's an action-adventure game that has a single-player story mode and an online co-op story mode. So you can play it with some other player. And as always with video games, it's better to show than tell. So there's a bit of a trailer about the game. It's okay without sound. So the game is based on visually in like the 60s, 70s, futurism. So what we would call nowadays like retro sci-fi. And it's taking a lot of influence on old sci-fi movies and series like Star Trek, Space Odyssey 2001, The Moon, and other these similar things where everything is like really low tech and everything is pretty much analog, so not that much of like over-designed visuals. Okay. Is there a problem on the video? So currently the platform that we are building this on is on the high-end side on the PlayStation VR and the PC on Oculus and Vive. And we have a pretty old-school team, people around pretty much from Remedy and Unity Technologies that we have mixed together. And almost the whole team has been working on AAA games over past 10 years up to this date. So, about a little bit of how we started on thinking about the whole VR, because this was our first VR game that we are building right now, and the VR series is just figuring out what are the constraints that you have. Since VR is a new media, we need to figure out what you can and you can't do, and what is actually there for the technology. And since we started a year ago, pretty much what was available back then was Vive, some dev kits from Oculus with the touch controllers, PlayStation VR was coming out, and mobile VR. But the mobile VR, it was mostly about just having the headset and having the rotation and nothing much more of that side. Advantage was to figure out is how much space does the player need for playing VR games. And of course, there's limitations of on Vive, there's the room scale. On PlayStation VR, there's mostly seated experience. On mobile, it's pretty much you can move around, watch behind you, but not that much moving. And other one was just to decide of which one will it be, on mobile or the desktop. And the mobile and desktop, of course, the actual difference right now is on the graphics fidelity. And right now there's already more about options on the moving side and tracking side on that side. So how we started on figuring out overall about the game itself was the free movement side. And since we wanted to, we are really accustomed to doing these really high-end AAA games with engaging stories. And what we really wanted to have is the free movement, because that's custom, you tell a story by you travel around the game world. But we had one thing was that the teleportation, it breaks the immersion, and that's the most common way of the locomotion itself. So we didn't want to do that. We wanted to find some other ways to do it. to the movement itself. And on the free movement, on VR, there's the big problem about the nausea and the motion sickness and the causes of that. So like, it was really preventing us that we can't make free movement because it makes people physically sick. So we are stuck on the teleportation side. And then we decided, okay, if we can't actually solve this problem, then we will never make any VR games. So what we knew beforehand is that the linear movement, that kind of works. If you specify the linear movement in VR in a certain way, it doesn't make people sick. And while we're just doing the normal development work, we noticed that, okay, if we just take an object, a huge object, and move it around by using our hand, you don't really get sick. And then we figure out, okay, no, actually, on the object's point of view, the player is actually moving. So let's do the movement that way, where you drag yourself around the world. And we noticed, like, wow, this kind of works, and nobody's getting sick about this movement method. And combined with the linear movement, we noticed that, okay, if you just drag yourself around, and then you release, you have a zero gravity, and it's like, everything is okay. Of course, it had some certain little nuances of all that side, but eventually we figured out, okay, this is one way to do it. But then we ended up having a problem about stopping the movement. Because like, if you just stop the movement instantly while you're flying through air, people tend to get really sick on that. And then we figured out, oh, we can't do this because like, it's not to fly around, but the movement gets you sick. So we started to figure out, okay, there's actually a certain dampening curve that it actually fixes that issue. Because the same thing like happens in real life. If you bump in something, you take a hold with hand, and you actually bounce, like, just a little bit. And while doing that development work, we also noticed that, okay, the peripheral vision, if there's a lot of movement on that side, like, edges of your eyes, you tend to get sick. It's kind of the same thing when you're sitting in a car, reading a book on the passenger's place, and then you start getting sick because, like, you see all the movement around you. So when we were like going through like all of this cycle of like figuring out what kind of different moving methods there are for the VR, we started to notice that about the VR sickness itself, the nausea, it's not about like certain thing like the linear movement or tracking with your hands. It's more about the matching the player's expectations. Like the players expect certain things to happen. It's most likely lizard brain thing. And if you don't meet those expectations, then your lizard brain does the only thing it knows, that you're probably poisoned and you get sick. So by that we started to figure out actually more different ways of doing the free movements. And now on the game we have multiple different methods already for the moving side. One is that we saw on the video where you can just take a hold from something and fly around. So, but talking about the immersion, of course, like the teleportation, it's really bad because you instantly, every time you move, it breaks the immersion. Every time it tells you, hey, you're in a video game. This is not the real world. So even by having the free movement, so that then comes next thing is the player interactions, because after all, we make games, and they have a lot of gamey things, and you have to have highlights and outlines and tutorials. Then it's about like figuring out like what pace do you give that information for the player. And for all the game interactions, we just have like one rule that pretty much make it physical. Everything has to be something like you use your hands with and you do something with your body. And because it feels way more natural, and of course it's fun, and it's not something you have to get really off from designing games for tablet or keyboard and mouse, and more think about like how you can actually utilize your whole body around you. And other one is the hands. And this was just like everybody knows this at this point already, but at least a year ago, there wasn't that much of like research information of like using hands in games. Like, what's the proper way of doing that? So your hands are like pretty much the language from the game designer, or our level designer, and the interaction designer to the player itself. of like just simple thing is that showing the hand poses and like how the interaction can be used. Very simple thing is like it's just like when you get close to a button or slider, you show like just the index fingers. If you have a knob, we all know that you can turn the knob like this. So if you have the right hand pose, it already tells you like, hey, how you're going to use the item. And we had a big problem on the moving method of like how we teach the movement to the player, because no one of us have been actually in a zero gravity in space. So like how to tell that you can actually take hold from anywhere, anything, and you can fly through the air. And that was one thing like I noticed that when looking at people around the office, when they were working, that every time when they came to any kind of object they wanted to pick up, what they did was like, normally you have your hand like in relaxed pose like this one, then you get close to something, and then you always automatically open up your whole palm. And I noticed that like everybody does that. Every time you reach out for a mouse, you automatically just open your hand. And then it's kind of like different paths in your brain that says like, hey, let's actually do something with that. So it's like it's a decision, like let's grab this and do something with it. So when we started to adding those interactions to like that hand pose to the game, we noticed like all the test users started to figure out like, okay, what I can actually grab and move and do something with it. And it kind of makes sense because, like, as humans, we are really good at reading people's faces. And other thing is that we are really good at reading hands because we pretty much look at this. Most of the people look at their hands like most of their life when they are doing something. So it's a brilliant language to do that without making anything really gamey. About the player guidance a little bit, that was also like a bit of a problem for us. Like how do we point the player to go in a certain direction to get the right information of like what is expected from the player without doing gamey things like UIs and things like that. So we came up with this idea of like there's a decrease of information because you tend to have like the same mental capacity all the time, but if you have like 360 degrees of information around you, like then everything is as important in a way. So if you get it lower to 90 degrees, that's like there's nothing else around you except that one thing, then you focus more on that, and then you start figuring out like what are the details on that one single thing. And on VR, it's actually more critical than in traditional first-person shooter games or first-person games. And you have to use much, much higher contrast between the areas. So it has to be really dark and really bright, the things that you want to really pull the player's focus on, because there's just so huge amount of information around. And other one is that keeping it everything in context. So everything that player does, usually what you notice in testing is that when people move around, play the game, and then they do an action, like let's say they press a button. So what they do is they focus their eyes completely on the button, they press the button, and that's kind of a bit of a problem because that's only like, usually if you press something, something else happens. So this is just like a rule thing, like, everything should be always in the context that if you press the button, if a door opens in another location, just doing a spatial sound effect isn't enough, but it has to be really visually that you will see the door and the button at the same time, so you can make the instant visual connection between those elements. So some of the gameplay breaking illusions that are there. One is the highlights. So when you're playing a VR game, like even though you get into, let me take it back a little bit. Sorry, I'm finished. About the highlights is that it's that just filtering the objects in VR games of what you can interact with, what is important and what is not. One option is to use highlights and outlines on those items, so you can make a better connection of those things, like what is crap items, what is the important quest items. But the problem is that every time it reminds you, this is a game thing, so there's a lot of design work on how to get over with that. Most of the players, they don't actually bother dealing with that is like, it's fine with them, but there are some people who have the problem. Other one is inventory. That's a constant problem in the VR games because we don't really have inventory in our real lives. We don't have that kind of abstraction. We have pockets and we have backpacks and things like that. But if you're making a fast-paced action game with lots of guns that you're always carrying around, they just virtually, like, mystically comes from somewhere. So that tends to be every time like this really abstract thing. Holograms, like hologram-type UIs, those are like really heavily used in VR games that we tend to see. But the problem is with that, like that we don't really have holograms in our real life. Closest thing is like having iPads, phones, and having like that kind of interfaces. And tutorials. And the rule that we use in tutorials is that we try to keep the tutorials in the really start of the game. So it's okay for like first 15, 30 minutes to keep on breaking the illusion, a little by little, because the player hasn't actually invested themselves that much to the game yet. So in a really early phasing of the game, it's okay to break the illusion constantly, but there has to be a certain moment that you really stop doing that. Because nothing is more annoying that you're really into the game and there's like, oh yeah, it's a game thing. And there's something that we really learned from was the achievements. And achievements and VR, they don't work that well together. So let's say like the normal way of like designing achievements that if you player does a thing in the game, there's something massive, something beautiful happens, and like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. And then you get pop achievement. Hey, you did a game thing. Good for you. Here's an achievement for you. So don't do that. We kind of did that by mistake, and it instantly breaks everything, the whole build-up for the experience, and definitely not participation awards. So, aka the lazy metrics. So this is really heavily commonly used in lots of console games of like, you get an achievement for passing through the tutorial or finishing the first part of the game, the second part. And in VR, it's like extra bad of doing that. It's bad on that side. So I went a little bit fast on this side.
It's fine, absolutely fine. It's good, it gives us some time for question and answer. Does anyone have any questions? If so, raise your hand like the gentleman at the front.
Yep.
Thank you. Hi, Jan from Black Cell. I agree and disagree with almost everything you said on that last slide. Oh, so to make things interesting a little. What you said is that we shouldn't do that. And what I would say is we shouldn't do that as it has been done before. So when you mention achievements or when you mention highlights and inventory, all that to me sounds like you're talking about interface. Like you shouldn't have a 2D interface pop up in your experience because you're breaking the immersion.
Yeah.
But the essential structure of these things, like achievements motivate you. Inventory may be needed for you to have more than one object that you can use. They should very much be in your game. You should just think about them differently, I think, is the take that I would have. We have, in our game, for example, we have an achievement where somebody just says to you, you've done that really well. It's more clever than that, but that's basically what it is. Somebody comes on and says, whoa, I'm really impressed by what you did. And that's an achievement. And then you can actually also pull an achievement on the Steam store. You just don't do a 2D overlay in your world. So would you say it's a question of we not having developed the right, let's say, vocabulary for these things yet?
Yeah, it's more about that side. We don't have strict UX guidelines yet on the VR on how, like, what is the correct way of doing these things. So we have a lot of like missing the language still. Like, of course, like we are pulling a lot from like traditional game design from console and desktop games on the abstraction about the UI, and that kind of same abstraction doesn't really work on VR. It's a really problematic. And same thing with achievements. Like achievements, they're okay. Like as long as if you want to show the show the achievements inside of the game, it should be something really gamey. Like the player has like, the player had decided of like, I'm going to do this stupid thing 10 times now. And then the game says like, yep, you did this stupid thing 10 times now. And the player is like, yes, I did. So that works really well. And otherwise, it's really good like showing the achievements when you end the game session or when you start the next game session. That's the other one, when you should, pop these things out. But of course, like, a lot of things are similar than on the traditional game side as well. Yeah.
And one last question here.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. A question about art. How much do you feel having realistic art contributes to the final immersion, and do you feel like having a more minimalistic style lessens the impact of immersion?
Quite a lot, actually. We invested quite a lot from the graphic side. One is that since the co-op game, it's online co-op, we invested a lot of the other character model. So you can see all the hand movements, all the head movements, and you can actually read the other person as a person. So we noticed that it really, really brings up the immersion to really natural, like you actually can read this as a real person. And otherwise is about environment art, and we kept the environment art as a really clean and simple as like this 70s, 60s futurism is. And that's the biggest reason for that is that it's easy to read itself. So it's really easy, like when you get to a new room, to a new area, it's really simple to read how this whole area works like and what is that you are expected to do in here and how you move around. So yeah.